The sun rose on a battlefield that no longer felt like a place of war, but a place of waiting, waiting for the inevitable, for the end. The Empire's banners still stood, but they hung heavy, torn by wind and defeat, symbols of power that now felt painfully hollow. Every road was cut off, every supply line severed. Ahead stood an enemy force so vast it seemed less like an army and more like a moving horizon. The numbers told a merciless story. They were outmatched, outmaneuvered, and surrounded on every side. Scouts had stopped bringing hopeful news days ago. Now they only confirmed what everyone already knew. There would be no reinforcements, no miraculous rescue, no sudden shift in fortune. The Empire was alone, and the world was watching to see how it would die. Inside the camps, silence replaced confidence. Soldiers who once marched with certainty now avoided each other's eyes. Armor felt heavier. Weapons felt useless.
Even the veterans, men hardened by decades of bloodshed, whispered the same word when they thought no one was listening. Finished. This was not fear of battle. This was fear of extinction. Leaders gathered again and again, poring over maps that no longer offered solutions. Every path forward ended the same way. Attack and be crushed. Hold position and starve. Retreat and be hunted down piece by piece. Logic itself had turned against them. Strategy, once their greatest strength, now boxed them in like a cage. Worse still was the knowledge that this moment had not come from a single disaster, but from a slow tightening of fate. Allies had vanished. Promises had broken. Weather, terrain, and timing had all aligned against them with cruel precision. It felt less like coincidence and more like judgment, as if history itself had decided this empire had reached its limit. Rumors spread faster than orders. Some spoke of surrender, though everyone knew what surrender meant. Others spoke of fighting to the last man, not for victory, but for pride. Yet beneath every argument lay the same unspoken truth. None of it would matter. The enemy did not need to outthink them anymore. Time was enough. As night fell, fires burned low, not to conserve fuel, but because no one had the energy to tend them. Men stared into the darkness beyond the camp, imagining the mass of forces waiting there, patient and certain. This was how empires ended, not always in flames, but in quiet realization. The realization that strength had finally met its match. And yet, hidden beneath the weight of despair, something dangerous began to form. Not hope, not confidence, but desperation sharp enough to cut through tradition, pride, and fear. Because when every option leads to death, even the unthinkable begins to feel possible.
As dawn approached, a question hung in the air, one that would force the Empire to confront not how it wanted to be remembered, but whether it would be remembered at all. And to answer it, they would have to look back, to understand how a power built for conquest had become so perfectly trapped. This empire was never designed to endure quiet, grinding pressure. It was forged for momentum, expansion, and decisive victory. From its earliest days, success came fast and violently. Enemies fell before they could adapt, territories were absorbed before resistance could organize, and each triumph reinforced the belief that hesitation was weakness. Its leaders built a system that rewarded boldness above all else. Generals were celebrated not for caution, but for speed. Campaigns were planned around overwhelming force, rapid advances, and the assumption that the enemy would break first. And for generations, that assumption was correct.
The empire did not merely win wars, it ended them quickly, before doubt or fatigue could take root. With every conquest, confidence hardened into doctrine. Logistics were streamlined for attack, not defense. Supply chains were designed to move forward, not hold ground. Diplomacy existed, but only as a tool to isolate the next target. Survival was never questioned, because survival had never been threatened. The empire believed that power, once gained, was permanent. This philosophy shaped more than the military. It shaped culture, politics, and identity. Citizens were raised on stories of unstoppable legions and brilliant commanders. Failure was framed as weakness, retreat as disgrace. Adaptation was unnecessary when dominance felt inevitable. The empire did not learn how to bend because it had never needed to. But systems built for constant victory carry a hidden flaw. They grow rigid. They depend on predictable outcomes. When circumstances change, they struggle to respond.
The same structures that once created order now resist adjustment, clinging to traditions that worked in a different world. As rivals observed and learned, they stopped fighting the empire head-on. They waited. They adapted. They exploited the blind spots created by arrogance and habit. Slowly, the balance shifted. The empire still looked powerful, but its strength was narrow, specialized, and fragile under the wrong conditions. By the time danger became undeniable, the foundations were already set. Leaders reached instinctively for familiar solutions, repeating strategies that had once guaranteed success. But momentum had vanished. Speed no longer solved problems. Overwhelming force could no longer be assembled in time. What had once been the empire's greatest advantage, its relentless drive forward, now trapped it in a situation it was never meant to survive.
And as the present closed in, the question was no longer how the empire rose so high, but whether it had unknowingly built the very path to its own destruction. There had never been a manual for retreat, endurance, or reinvention. Those ideas belonged to weaker states, to enemies expected to fall. Now, faced with an unfamiliar kind of threat, the empire discovered that glory offered no instructions for survival. Its past victories became a burden, shaping instincts that no longer fit reality. And as pressure mounted, the machinery of greatness began to grind against itself, unable to imagine a future beyond conquest. That failure of imagination would soon matter more than numbers, weapons, or courage, as the empire approached its defining test, alone ahead. They were not feared because they were unknown. They were feared because everyone knew exactly what happened when they arrived. Cities emptied before their banners appeared. Armies dissolved before battle was joined.
Their reputation traveled faster than their messengers, carried by survivors who spoke less of tactics and more of inevitability. The enemy did not fight like the empires of the past. They did not rely on a single decisive clash or heroic charges meant to break morale in one stroke. They advanced like pressure, slow and relentless, denying space, time, and options. Where others sought glory, they sought exhaustion. Where others rushed, they waited. Their numbers alone were overwhelming, not just soldiers, but systems, layers of command that adapted quickly, supply lines that bent around terrain, scouts who mapped weaknesses long before armies moved. Every loss they suffered was absorbed, redistributed, replaced. Every mistake became a lesson folded back into their strategy. What truly broke their opponents was not defeat, but anticipation. Everyone knew how this ended, because it had ended the same way before. First came encirclement, then isolation.
Then the slow collapse of morale as hope drained away day by day. By the time battle was offered, it was no longer a chance for victory, only a formality. They understood psychology better than most understood weapons. They spread rumors deliberately. They allowed some enemies to escape, knowing fear would do more damage than pursuit. They struck supply lines instead of walls, patience instead of passion. Resistance was not crushed immediately. It was worn down until surrender felt like relief. Even the empire's allies believed the same thing. Messages arrived filled with sympathy, not plans, encouragement, not reinforcements. No one wanted to be caught standing beside a doomed power. Neutral states closed their gates. Former friends suddenly remembered old disputes. The enemy had not yet attacked, but the empire was already alone. Within the ranks, comparisons were unavoidable. The empire fought to win quickly. The enemy fought to ensure the other side could not win at all.
Every encounter reinforced the imbalance. Every skirmish ended not in decisive loss, but incremental weakening.
and incremental weakness, repeated enough times, became certainty. Stories circulated of other great powers that had tried to stand firm. Some had fielded larger armies, others had stronger defenses or more experienced commanders. None had stopped the advance. The details differed, but the conclusion never did. Eventually, every road led to the same outcome. This was not an enemy that needed to prove itself. Its past victories had already done that. It did not posture or threaten, it simply moved forward, confident that resistance would exhaust itself long before their own resolved it. Against such an opponent, courage felt irrelevant, skill insufficient, and tradition meaningless. By now, even the most defiant voices inside the empire spoke differently, not of winning, but of delaying, not of defeating, but of surviving a little longer.
The belief that resistance was pointless had seeped into every conversation, every calculation. And when an enemy conquers your expectations before conquering your land, the battle is already half over. Yet history had not finished unfolding, because when inevitability feels complete, it often hides a weakness no one thinks to look for. And the path to that weakness began not with the enemy's strength, but with the empire's own mistakes. The empire did not fall into this trap by accident. Each step toward disaster felt reasonable at the time, even justified. That is what made it fatal. The first mistake was success itself. Victory after victory convinced leaders that their instincts were infallible. When warnings appeared, they were dismissed as pessimism or worse, disloyalty. Strategists assumed the enemy would react the way past enemies always had. They expected fear, disorganization, and collapse. Instead, they faced patience and adaptation.
Early reports describing this difference were softened before reaching the highest levels. No one wanted to be the voice that questioned a system built on generations of triumph. Political rivalries deepened the problem. Commanders competed for glory rather than coordination. Resources were allocated based on influence, not necessity. Decisions that should have been unified became fragmented, slowed by debate and ego. By the time consensus formed, the situation on the ground had already changed. The empire also trusted allies who had already begun planning for its downfall. Treaties were honored on paper while borders quietly closed. Intelligence warnings went unverified because they contradicted diplomatic assurances. When support finally vanished, it felt sudden, though the signs had been visible for years. Logistics suffered from the same arrogance. Supply routes were stretched too far, protected too lightly. Planners assumed dominance would keep enemies away.
Instead, those routes became targets. Each disruption was treated as temporary, until temporary became permanent. Hunger and exhaustion followed, eroding strength long before battle began. Perhaps the most dangerous mistake was moral certainty. Leaders believed their cause was righteous, and that belief hardened into blindness. Any suggestion that adaptation was needed sounded like betrayal of tradition. They mistook flexibility for weakness and pride for stability. As pressure mounted, internal blame replaced honest analysis. Generals accused politicians. Politicians accused commanders. Responsibility fractured, just as unity was needed most. Decisions slowed further, paralyzed by fear of being wrong. In trying to protect their legacies, leaders ensured none would survive intact. Even when the enemy's strategy became obvious, the empire reacted too late. Countermeasures were half implemented, compromises that satisfied tradition but solved nothing.
Every delayed response narrowed the remaining options. The empire was not defeated in one moment, but worn down by 1,000 reasonable choices that added up to catastrophe. By the time they recognized the pattern, escape was impossible. They stood trapped by their own history, doctrines, and pride. The realization was bitter. Intelligence and experience had not failed them. Confidence had. And now, with the enemy closing in and time running out, the empire faced the consequence of every earlier decision. There would be no perfect solution, no clean victory, only a final choice made under unbearable pressure, one that would either confirm their downfall or shatter every belief they had clung to until now. The trap closed quietly.
No horn sounded, no final charge announced itself. Geography did the work instead. Hills blocked retreat, rivers cut supply, and narrow passes turned movement into vulnerability.
What once felt like defensible terrain now felt like a sealed room slowly losing air. Hours mattered now, not days, not even half days. Food stores were measured again and again, each count confirming the same truth. They could fight for a while, they could endure hunger for a while, but time was no longer an ally. It was an enemy, advancing faster than any army. Messages arrived late or not at all. Scouts returned exhausted, reporting the same impossible sight in every direction. Enemy positions tightening, escape routes dissolving. Every path forward demanded a sacrifice that would not buy survival, only delay. Among the soldiers, the shift was visible. Discipline remained, but belief thinned. Men followed orders out of habit, not expectation. Laughter vanished. Conversations became practical, then silent. Some cleaned weapons obsessively. Others sat still, conserving energy for an ending they could not name. Commanders felt the weight most sharply. Maps no longer offered options, only reminders of confinement. Any movement risked collapse. Any stillness invited starvation. The calculations were brutal and simple. Lose now or lose later, but lose regardless. Morale frayed unevenly. Younger soldiers clung to rumor, to the idea that something unseen might still change. Veterans knew better. They recognized the shape of this moment from other wars, other armies. The moment when strategy gives way to survival instincts, and survival instincts offer nothing useful. Even pride became a burden. To retreat meant chaos. To surrender meant erasure. To fight meant annihilation. Every choice carried consequences that could not be undone. Leadership was no longer about victory, but about choosing how the story ended. As night pressed in, the camp felt smaller than it had ever been. Sounds carried too far. Fires burned too bright, then were smothered. The enemy did not attack. They did not need to. Waiting was enough.
This was the space where empires usually broke. Not in battle, but in the hours before it, when certainty collapses and fear sharpens every thought. And it was here, inside this narrowing window of time, that the empire would be forced to confront an option so dangerous it had never been spoken aloud. No one slept. Breaths were counted, not hours. Every sound from the darkness felt intentional, every silence threatening. The enemy's restraint was its own message. There was nowhere left to run. By morning, a decision would have to be made, not because it was wise, but because inaction was no longer possible. And in that suffocating stillness, a single idea began to surface, fragile, radical, and terrifying. It promised no safety, no honor, only a chance to survive by abandoning everything the empire believed about power. That idea would soon divide leaders, shock soldiers, and force the empire toward the most dangerous choice of its existence, before history closed in around them.
The council assembled before dawn, not out of tradition, but necessity. Faces that once carried certainty now showed strain, shadows carved by sleepless hours. Rank mattered less here than survival, yet hierarchy still shaped the room. Some voices carried authority, others carried fear disguised as confidence. The debate began where all others had ended. Honor, legacy, the obligation to ancestors who had built the empire through conquest and strength. Several commanders argued that survival without dignity was not survival at all. Better to fall visibly, decisively, than to live diminished. Their words resonated with tradition, and tradition had always guided them. Others spoke of reality. They listed numbers, supplies, terrain, and time. Their arguments lacked poetry, but not urgency. Honor, they said, meant nothing to the dead. The empire could not defend its legacy if it ceased to exist. Survival, even in altered form, was still survival. The room fractured along a familiar line.
Tradition versus adaptation. The past versus the present. Each side accused the other of betrayal, one for abandoning identity, the other for clinging to it blindly. Tempers flared, then cooled, then flared again. Every argument circled the same truth. None of the conventional options worked. Then the radical proposal surfaced, quietly at first, almost reluctantly. It violated doctrine, reversed centuries of strategy, and reframed weakness as opportunity. The reaction was immediate and hostile. Some dismissed it as madness. Others called it cowardice disguised as cleverness. A few accused its supporters of accelerating the empire's destruction. The proposal demanded abandoning the very principles that had defined power. It required trusting the enemy's expectations more than one's own strength. It asked leaders to sacrifice pride, certainty, and control in exchange for unpredictability. It offered no guarantee of success, only the possibility of survival. Silence followed.
Not agreement, not acceptance, but recognition. Recognition that every other option had already failed. The argument shifted from whether the idea was dangerous to whether danger mattered anymore. Because what frightened them most was not the risk of trying, but the certainty of doing nothing. Gradually, resistance softened, not into enthusiasm, but into grim calculation. Leaders asked questions they never imagined asking. What would this cost? What would be lost forever? And what, if anything, might be saved? Each answer carried discomfort, but also clarity. When the final decision was called for, no one spoke confidently. There was no rallying speech, no dramatic vote, only nods, pauses, and reluctant consent. The council did not believe in the plan. They believed in the absence of alternatives. As they dispersed, the weight of the choice settled in. The empire had chosen to gamble its identity to preserve its existence. What remained was execution.
And once set in motion, there would be no retreat, no explanation, and no second chance. The next hours would reveal whether this decision was a masterstroke of survival or the final mistake that confirmed everything the enemy believed about them. The decision was simple to describe, but almost impossible to accept. The empire would not fight. Not now, not here, not in the way anyone expected. Instead of meeting force with force, it would do the one thing its enemies, its allies, and even its own people believed unthinkable. It would step aside from the battle it was supposed to lose. To generations raised on conquest, this sounded like surrender in disguise. Armies existed to engage, to dominate, to impose will through strength. Power was visible, loud, undeniable. This decision stripped power of all those familiar shapes. It asked the empire to survive by refusing to perform strength at the moment it was most demanded. Critics called it cowardice.
How could an empire that had crushed rivals and reshaped continents choose restraint when surrounded? Others warned it would invite total destruction. An enemy built on pressure, they argued, would interpret hesitation as weakness and close in faster. History offered no examples this path could point to with confidence. What made the decision so dangerous was not just what it proposed, but what it rejected. It rejected heroic sacrifice. It rejected decisive battle. It rejected the belief that leadership meant standing visibly at the center of conflict. Instead, it relied on something far more uncertain: psychology. The empire understood something others overlooked. The enemy's greatest strength was not numbers or discipline, but expectation. They expected resistance. They expected fear to harden into desperation. They expected predictable reactions that could be managed, delayed, and dismantled. This decision aimed to deny them that script entirely. By refusing to act as a cornered empire was supposed to act, the leadership hoped to create confusion where certainty had ruled. The plan did not promise victory in the traditional sense. It promised disruption. It sought to turn inevitability into hesitation, and hesitation into opportunity. Implementing it felt like walking into darkness without armor.
Orders contradicted centuries of doctrine. Officers struggled to explain actions that felt wrong even as they followed them. Soldiers were confused, some angry, others relieved. No one felt confident. Confidence was not part of the strategy. From the outside, it looked like collapse, movements that appeared disorganized, signals that suggested fracture, silence where defiance was expected. The Empire was deliberately allowing itself to appear weaker than it truly was, betting that perception could become a weapon. This was leadership inverted, not commanding attention, but avoiding it, not escalating, but withdrawing in precise ways.
It required trust, not only in the plan, but in the enemy's inability to adapt quickly to something so completely outside their experience. Every instinct screamed that this was wrong, that empires survived by asserting dominance, not by questioning it. Yet the very irrationality of the decision was its strength. It exploited the enemy's certainty the same way they had exploited the empire's habits. Nothing like this had ever been attempted by a power of such scale. That was why no one believed in it, and that disbelief was exactly what the empire was counting on. Because if the enemy did not understand what they were seeing, they could not respond with confidence. And in war, confidence lost for even a moment can change everything. At first, nothing happened. That was the most unsettling part. No immediate counterattack, no sudden collapse. The enemy paused, watching movements that did not fit any familiar pattern. Reports conflicted. Some scouts claimed the empire was retreating.
Others insisted it was repositioning. No one could agree on what they were seeing. Inside the empire's ranks, doubt spread quickly. Soldiers expected punishment to follow restraint. Instead, hours passed without engagement. The silence felt unnatural, heavier than bombardment. Men braced for impact that never came, nerves stretched thin by uncertainty rather than fear. The enemy's commanders faced a problem they had not prepared for. Their strategy relied on pressure and prediction. They advanced by narrowing options, forcing reactions, exhausting resistance. But now the reactions were missing. The pressure met empty space. The machine stalled, not from resistance, but from ambiguity. Orders slowed. Verification replaced momentum. Leaders demanded clearer intelligence before committing forces. The advance that had once felt inevitable began to hesitate, just slightly, just enough to matter. In war, hesitation is contagious. Small signs appeared first.
Enemy units delayed movements that should have been automatic. Supply columns paused, waiting for instructions. Scouts pushed farther than planned, searching for confirmation of weakness that refused to present itself. Every extra hour created questions that had no clean answers. Meanwhile, the Empire used time with surgical care. Movements were deliberate, limited, and controlled. Nothing dramatic, nothing heroic, just enough to reinforce confusion without revealing intent. The goal was not to look strong, but to remain unreadable. Psychological pressure began to shift. Soldiers on the enemy side, accustomed to certainty, whispered doubts. If the Empire was truly broken, why was it not behaving like a defeated power? Why abandon the final stand everyone expected? What trap required such restraint? The enemy had always relied on the predictability of fear. Now fear had no shape, and without shape, it could not be exploited. Within the Empire, disbelief turned cautiously into awareness.
The plan was not winning, but it was working. For the first time in days, time stopped moving against them. Each hour gained felt unnatural, stolen from fate itself. This was not victory. It was space. Space to breathe. Space to think. Space the enemy had never allowed before. And in that space, possibility reappeared. The most dangerous moments came when nothing happened at all. Leaders fought the urge to act, to assert control, to return to familiar behavior. Restraint required discipline greater than aggression. One wrong move could restore the old pattern instantly. But the enemy's certainty had cracked. That was the real shift, not on the battlefield, but in expectation. The Empire had proven one thing beyond doubt. Inevitability was not absolute. As confusion deepened, the enemy adjusted, but slowly, cautiously. And that delay, born of uncertainty rather than force, opened a door no one believed existed.
What came next would determine whether the Empire merely survived this moment or transformed it into something far more powerful. Victory did not arrive with cheers or sudden conquest. It arrived quietly, almost unnoticed at first, disguised as continued survival. Then, as momentum shifted, survival hardened into advantage. The enemy, once certain of the ending, found itself reacting instead of dictating. That reversal changed everything. What the Empire had gained was not strength in the traditional sense, but control of tempo. By refusing to play the expected role, it forced the enemy into a position of doubt. Every move now required confirmation. Every advance demanded justification. The machine that had crushed others through inevitability began to slow under the weight of its own caution. The Empire used that hesitation with precision. Routes once sealed were reopened, not by force, but by absence.
Pressure points dissolved as the enemy redistributed troops to cover threats that never materialized. Each adjustment weakened their cohesion, stretching a system designed for certainty into one struggling with ambiguity. Soon, escape was no longer theoretical. It was real. Units repositioned without pursuit. Supplies reached places they should not have. The Empire slipped through gaps created not by victory in battle, but by victory in perception. The enemy had been outmaneuvered without realizing a maneuver had taken place. From the outside, it looked like the impossible. An empire that should have collapsed instead re-emerged intact. Allies reconsidered. Neutral powers recalculated. The narrative shifted from inevitability of defeat to questions of how such an outcome had been allowed to happen. The enemy attempted to reassert dominance, but the moment had passed. Their greatest weapon, certainty, was gone. They could still fight. They could still win battles.
But the aura of inevitability that had broken resistance elsewhere no longer held, and without it, their superiority was just another variable. For the Empire, the transformation was profound. Leadership redefined itself. Power was no longer measured solely by force projected, but by reactions controlled. Intelligence was not just information gathered, but expectations shaped. Strategy became less about domination and more about denial, denying the enemy clarity, rhythm, and confidence. This was not luck. Luck does not repeat. This was adaptation under pressure, the willingness to abandon identity to preserve existence. The Empire had learned that survival sometimes demands invisibility, that restraint can be louder than defiance, and that unpredictability can shatter even the strongest opponent. In time, the Empire regained influence, not through immediate conquest, but through presence. It existed where it was not supposed to. It acted where it was not expected.
That alone reshaped the balance of power. The lesson echoed far beyond the battlefield. Others would study this moment and misunderstand it, searching for tactics instead of principles. But the truth was simpler and more unsettling. Power was no longer just about overwhelming strength. It was about rewriting the rules of engagement when the old ones guaranteed defeat. The Empire had not just escaped destruction, it had exposed a flaw in inevitability itself, and in doing so, it redefined what it meant to win. Not by defeating the enemy outright, but by surviving long enough to make their certainty collapse under its own weight. Empires rarely collapse the way people imagine. They do not always fall to stronger armies or superior weapons. More often, they fall to certainty, to the belief that what worked before must work again, even when the world has changed beyond recognition. This empire did not stand on the edge of extinction because it lacked strength.
It stood there because its strength had become a habit, a pattern so deeply embedded that abandoning it felt worse than death. And that is the trap history repeats endlessly. When pressure rises, power tends to double down. Leaders cling tighter to tradition, to identity, to familiar displays of dominance. They confuse consistency with stability.
But in moments of true crisis, consistency can be fatal. Survival may demand contradiction, discomfort, and decisions that look wrong before they look brilliant. The choice that saved this empire was not clever in the conventional sense. It was not a secret weapon or a flawless maneuver. It was the willingness to stop performing power and start redefining it, to accept temporary humiliation in exchange for long-term existence, to choose survival over storytelling. That choice feels unthinkable because it threatens legacy. Leaders fear not just losing, but being remembered as weak.
Yet history is rarely kind to those who choose glorious collapse over quiet endurance. Empires are not judged by how loudly they fall, but by whether they endure long enough to adapt. What makes this lesson uncomfortable is its simplicity. It suggests that collapse is often optional, not easy to avoid, not painless, but avoidable if leaders are willing to abandon certainty when certainty becomes a liability. Across history, countless powers faced similar moments, surrounded, pressured, certain of defeat. Most chose the familiar path and vanished, not because they had no options, but because they refused to consider the one that violated their identity. This story survives because the empire broke that pattern. It accepted that power is contextual, that strength without flexibility becomes fragility, that the enemy's greatest advantage was not force, but expectation, and expectations can be manipulated. The lesson still applies because the conditions still exist.
Systems grow successful, then rigid. Institutions reward repetition over adaptation. Leaders inherit victories and mistake them for permanence. When reality shifts, the instinct is to push harder in the same direction, even as the ground gives way. Empires today may not march armies across fields, but they face the same choice: adapt quietly or collapse loudly, redefine power or be trapped by it, question the rules or be destroyed by them. The uncomfortable truth is this: the most dangerous moment for any empire is not when it is weak, but when it is strong and inflexible. When survival demands a decision that feels humiliating, irrational, or impossible. Because history shows again and again that the empires which survive are not the ones that never face extinction. They are the ones willing to make the decision no one believes in, before certainty becomes a death sentence written in stone.